The deserts of Egypt shimmer under an eternal sun. Golden sands stretch beyond the horizon, where the Nile flows like a ribbon of life through a kingdom of stone and silence. Here, temples rise like mountains, carved with the names of gods and kings. And among them, the Pharaoh stood, not as a man, but as something greater. To his people, he was a living god. To his enemies, he was the sun itself, radiating power too blinding to confront. But history, when stripped of ceremony and stone, tells a darker story. Beneath the hymns sung in his honor and the colossal monuments erected in his name, there lingered shadows, secrets that no temple scribe dared etch into sacred walls. Whispers of sin, of cruelty masked as divinity, of choices so forbidden they haunted Egypt's throne for generations. This is not the story of Egypt's glory. This is the story of its most forbidden scandal, a pharaoh who married his own daughters. To understand how such an act could take place, you must first step into the mindset of ancient Egypt. For thousands of years, the pharaoh was not viewed as a ruler bound by human law. He was the embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and the earthly son of Ra, the sun itself. His blood was divine, his lineage was sacred, and if purity was threatened, then so too was the fragile balance between the mortal world and the heavens. The priests preached it, the monuments proclaimed it, and the people believed it. Egypt's survival depended on keeping the royal bloodline unbroken, untarnished, untouched by outsiders. And yet, this obsession with purity planted the seeds of Egypt's most horrific scandal. Imagine a palace in the heart of Thebes. Incense drifts through marble halls, gold catches the light of the setting sun, blinding in its brilliance. The air itself hums with ritual and ceremony. But behind the sanctity of these halls, the pharaoh was faced with a dilemma. How to preserve his throne, how to strengthen his divine legitimacy, and how to silence the whispers of rebellion that grew around him. His answer was unthinkable. He turned not to foreign queens, not to noble daughters of allied kingdoms, but to his own blood. His daughters, raised to revere him as both father and god, would now be commanded to become his wives. It was a decision cloaked in the sacred language of ritual. Priests performed ceremonies to frame the unions as divine, the will of the gods themselves. To question them was to question Egypt's cosmic order, but no amount of incense, no prayer, no hymn could wash away the truth. This was an act born of desperation, paranoia, and cruelty. In the eyes of the kingdom, the pharaoh was untouchable. He walked through gilded halls draped in jewels, his every gesture met with reverence. But within the palace walls, his daughters lived in a paradox. They were queens and prisoners, mothers and sisters, wives and daughters, bound by roles no mortal should bear, their identities fractured, their humanity buried beneath layers of ritual and silence. And though the temples celebrated these unions as divine, the people whispered. Whispers carried along the Nile, passed in marketplaces, murmured in hidden corners of Thebes. The gods were angry, they said. The land would suffer. Already the floods of the Nile had begun to falter. Already the harvests grew thinner. Could it be the pharaoh himself had cursed Egypt with his forbidden acts? The scandal was never etched onto papyrus. It was never carved into temple walls. Instead, it lived in rumor, in fragments of records half erased by successors who sought to bury the shame. Yet the truth refuses to die. Even in silence, it endures. What drives a man to such lengths? Was it lust masquerading as duty? Was it genuine belief in divine necessity? Or was it the simple, corrosive truth of power? Power so absolute that it dissolves the boundary between the sacred and the profane. The pharaoh's actions cannot be understood in the language of morality alone. They must be seen as both the product of his world and a violation so deep that even time recoils from it. In the coming chapters, we will follow this story not through monuments of gold, but through the shadows they tried to conceal. We will enter the royal chambers where innocence was lost. We will walk through the streets where rumors turned to rebellion. We will witness the unraveling of a dynasty built on cruelty disguised as divine necessity. This story is not about glory, it is about survival. It is about identity stolen, power corrupted, and trauma passed down through generations. It is about daughters trapped in golden cages, stripped of childhood, forced into roles that blurred the line between family and ritual. It is about a pharaoh who believed himself untouchable, only to discover that even gods bleed when they betray the order of life itself. Egypt remains eternal in stone. The pyramids stand, the temples whisper their hymns to the sky. But behind the grandeur, there lingers a silence darker than the tombs themselves. The silence of daughters whose voices were never written. The silence of trauma buried beneath ritual. The silence of a scandal that temples tried to erase, but memory refused to forgive. The pharaoh who married his daughters may have believed he was preserving divine order. Instead, he shattered it. His reign reminds us that cruelty, even when cloaked in gold and incense, leaves scars no monument can hide. This is his story. This is Egypt's forbidden scandal. And it begins in the shadows of a kingdom that worshipped the sun, but could not escape the darkness within its own palace walls. Before he was Pharaoh, before his name was etched into stone, before priests bowed at his feet, he was a boy born not into innocence, but into expectation. From the moment of his first breath, he was no ordinary child. He was heir to Egypt's throne, a vessel into which centuries of divine power, sacred duty, and crushing destiny were poured. His cradle was not woven reed but gold, gilded with protective charms. Around him, priests whispered blessings to the gods, while servants sang lullabies meant not to soothe a child but to honor a godling. He was not raised by his mother's arms, but by a system designed to mold him into more than human. Even as he learned to walk, his steps were rehearsals for processions he would one day lead. For most children, the world is discovery. For him, the world was already decided. His tutors spoke not of wonder, but of law, ritual, and bloodline. His toys were miniature scepters, symbols of power disguised as play. His bedtime stories were tales of Horus and Osiris, gods who ruled with order, gods who punished chaos. And always, always he was reminded that he was different, that he was not like other boys, that he carried the weight of gods in his veins. Born in marble halls, raised to believe he was divine, he learned early that ordinary laws did not bind him. From the very first breath, the boy who would one day rule Egypt was wrapped not in soft linen alone, but in centuries of expectation. His cradle was not carved from humble wood. It was cut from alabaster, veined like frozen lightning, gleaming under the temple lamps as if the gods themselves had delivered it. You can almost picture it, torches flickering against polished stone, priests chanting lullabies that were less about comfort and more about invocation, weaving his infant cries into hymns of immortality. His dynasty was obsessed with purity. Generations of pharaohs before him had bent not just kingdoms but bloodlines into their service, ensuring the veins of the royal child carried nothing but divine essence. Cousin married cousin, sister wed brother, and each union was justified not as weakness but as sacred duty. By the time he opened his eyes, the weight of that twisted devotion pressed down on him like an invisible crown. He was not merely a child, he was already a symbol. The boy's earliest teachers were not gentle mothers or playful companions. They were priests, their shaved heads gleaming in the sun, who taught him before he could even walk that his heartbeat was not his own. It belonged to Ra, to Osiris, to Horus, to the gods who demanded his every breath be divine. Scholars placed scrolls before him, papyrus crackling under his tiny hands, their ink still dark and fragrant, while generals in burnished bronze showed him miniature armies in the sand. But what he was denied is as haunting as what he was given. Imagine growing up in vast palace chambers where silence echoed louder than laughter, where the other children you glimpsed in the courtyards could never touch you, never play beside you, because their hands, their laughter, their very existence might pollute your sanctity. Even the servants who dressed him lowered their eyes, moving like ghosts, forbidden to speak. Childhood games, the warmth of a mother's hand, the bond of a sibling's rivalry, these were traded for ritual, for ceremony, for the suffocating weight of expectation. And here is where the seed was planted. When a child is told every day that he is not human, that he is something higher, untouchable, a god walking in mortal form, what happens inside his mind? On the surface, power blooms. He learns entitlement, the sense that rules written for others cannot touch him. He learns to see human morality as a chain meant for lesser beings. Yet beneath, something fragile forms. Isolation breeds an aching hunger for connection that is never satisfied. The boy begins to live in two worlds at once, one where he is adored, worshipped, and feared, another where he is desperately alone. Psychologists today would call it a God complex, yet also a fracture, an inner fragility born of isolation and overexposure to worship. He was both untouchable and unbearably vulnerable, a child surrounded by marble and gold, but starved of the simplest nourishment of all, ordinary human love. And you, yes, you can feel the tension in that, can't you? Imagine being raised in a house where no one dares tell you no, where every misstep is excused as divine mystery, where your smallest gesture is mirrored in statues towering over the city. At first it feels intoxicating, but deep inside a question festers. If I am a god, why do I feel so alone? If I am eternal, why do I long for something as fragile as a friend? Each morning the priests would bathe him not in water alone, but in ritual. Oils pressed from sacred plants shimmered across his skin, the air thick with frankincense and myrrh. As they anointed him, they whispered not words of comfort, but prophecies. You will conquer, you will endure, you will not die as men die. Their voices pressed into his ears like chains. At night, he lay in alabaster chambers where the painted stars on the ceiling imitated eternity, and yet the silence crept closer, filling him with an unnamed fear. This boy, destined to be Pharaoh, never learned to run barefoot through dust. He never scraped a knee that a loving hand rushed to soothe. He never had a childhood in the way you or I would understand it. Instead, his youth was a theatre, staged for gods and ancestors, where he learned his every movement was both performance and command. The weight of history sat upon his small shoulders, whispering that he must become more than mortal, or else the empire would crumble. And so entitlement grew like vines through his thoughts. If his laughter could become a hymn, if his anger could bend courtiers to their knees, then why should he see himself bound by the laws of men? Murder, mercy, cruelty, compassion, these were not opposites in his mind. They were tools, instruments given to him because he was not merely a boy, but the axis upon which the world turned. Still the cracks widened. Some nights the boy's attendants claimed they heard him speaking softly to shadows, as if searching for companionship where none existed. They whispered that he would trace the outlines of carved hieroglyphs with trembling fingers, lingering on the images of families, of mothers and fathers embracing children. In those stolen moments, the divine child revealed a different hunger, not for power but for something simple, human and forbidden. The paradox of his early life shaped everything to come. A child of marble halls, of chanting priests and silent servants, grew into a ruler who believed he could defy the laws of morality, even mortality itself. But he also carried within him a fragile wound, one that no crown, no conquest, no pyramid could ever truly heal. And this perhaps is the most haunting truth of all. When you raise a child to believe he is a god, you do not create divinity. You create a storm, an unstable mix of arrogance and emptiness, capable of greatness but equally capable of ruin. The boy who slept beneath painted stars would rise to command armies, to bend nations, to carve his name deeper into history than any child should dream. But the shadow of his early years never left him. It haunted his reign like a ghost, whispering through every decision he made. And as we move into the next part of his story, we must ask, when a ruler begins his life convinced that nothing human binds him, what kind of man and what kind of monster will he become? The crown weighed heavier than gold. It carried paranoia, dynastic decay, and the fear of gods abandoning Egypt. When the boy became Pharaoh, the alabaster cradle was traded for a gilded throne, but the weight pressing against his chest only grew. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt shimmered under the desert sun, but its brilliance concealed the cracks in the kingdom beneath. You must picture this moment not as triumph, but as suffocation. A young ruler, scarcely a man, raised to believe he was divine, now seated on a throne that trembled with unrest. Egypt was not the eternal, unshakable empire the priests promised him as a child. Famine whispered through the Nile Valley, the river's floods unpredictable, the soil less generous than in the golden days of ancestors. Traders muttered about dwindling roots, about foreign powers growing stronger, hungrier. Within the palace itself, whispers of rival claimants travelled like smoke, each cousin, uncle or half-sibling a potential spark that could ignite rebellion. The boy who had once longed for ordinary companionship now found every relative transformed into a possible assassin. And above it all hung the priests, their voices no longer lullabies but commandments, their eyes sharp with expectation. They told him Egypt's survival depended not on armies alone, but on purity. Purity of blood, purity of lineage, purity of divine essence. They invoked ancient prophecies that warned of ruin if the throne was ever tainted by outsider blood. Their words carried the weight of eternity. Allow impurity, and Egypt will fall. Keep the blood sacred, and the gods will remain. You can almost feel the pressure building. The young pharaoh's chest rising, breath uneven, as every council meeting became less about governance and more about preservation of himself, of his dynasty, of the illusion that his veins carried something greater than mortal blood. Paranoia was not born overnight, but it spread like ink across papyrus. At first it was subtle, glances cast too long at courtiers, questions asked too sharply of advisors, a hand lingering on the hilt of a ceremonial dagger during private audiences. But soon it grew into obsession. His father's shadow, his grandfather's decrees, the countless statues of past rulers all seemed to whisper the same message. You are the last defense against chaos. Fail, and the gods will abandon Egypt. Imagine living each day with that weight, every banquet. A test, every relative a possible usurper, every servant's silence a threat. He began to believe the gods had entrusted him alone with Egypt's survival, and that survival meant one thing above all: no blood but his own must touch the throne. But dynasties built on purity are fragile things. The tighter you cling, the more brittle the line becomes. Generations of intermarriage had already left their mark. Weaknesses in body, fevers in childhood, strange afflictions whispered about behind silken curtains. He saw it, though no one dared speak it. The divine blood was thinning, the bodies of his kin betraying the perfection priests insisted was eternal, and yet rather than loosen his grip, he tightened it further. He convinced himself that only greater devotion, stricter purity, could appease the gods and restore strength. Psychologists today might say he lived in a cage of inherited fear, every decision driven not by logic but by the desperate need to avoid becoming the pharaoh who let Egypt fall. His paranoia was both shield and prison, hardening into ritual, feeding on itself until it became unbreakable. Priests fed the fire. They showed him omens, stars dimming in the night sky, falcons flying the wrong direction, drought cracking the earth. They told him these were signs of the gods' displeasure. warnings that the throne teetered on the edge of abandonment. Advisors added their own weight. Outsiders must never taint the palace. Your blood alone is the river that nourishes Egypt. The words echoed day after day until they were no longer advice but prophecy that twisted itself into paranoia. And so the young pharaoh's isolation deepened. If as a child he was denied playmates, as a ruler he denied himself trust. No friend, no ally, no relative could stand fully outside suspicion. Every smile was inspected, every oath dissected for betrayal. He began to leap less, pacing marble corridors by torchlight, his eyes darting to every shadow as if they concealed knives. What happens when a man believes the survival of a civilization rests entirely on his blood? What happens when he is told by priests, by advisors, by tradition itself that no one else can be trusted? You begin to see how fear reshaped him. The crown was not gold, it was iron, pressing tighter with every heartbeat, warping his thoughts, suffocating his humanity. And you watching this now, can feel that burden pressing against your own chest, can't you? The dread of being told that if you falter, if you fail, an entire world will collapse. Most of us will never carry such a weight, but imagine if you did. How long before duty twists into delusion? How long before love becomes weakness and paranoia becomes the only language you speak? The stage was set, a kingdom trembling under famine and unrest, priests chanting prophecies of divine purity, advisors whispering warnings of betrayal, a ruler raised to believe he was God, now chained by the fear that gods might abandon him. The pharaoh convinced himself of one truth, and it would define his every action. Only his blood could guarantee legitimacy. Only his descendants, bound in the chains of purity, could protect Egypt from collapse. He believed this with the certainty of faith, with the desperation of a man watching sand slip through his hands. And so, the seeds of his fateful choices were planted. Choices that would echo through marble halls, through bloodlines, through the very soil of Egypt itself. Because when paranoia wears a crown, it does not merely haunt the man, it haunts the empire. But what happens when fear of betrayal, fear of impurity, fear of divine abandonment pushes a ruler to cross lines even gods might condemn? That is where his story turns darker still. In candlelit chambers, where incense blurred the line between ritual and sin, he crossed a boundary no pharaoh should. The marble halls that once each owed with chants of divinity now carried a different silence, one heavy, one suffocating. The young pharaoh, already haunted by paranoia, had convinced himself of a single truth: only his blood could preserve Egypt. And so, when the time came to secure heirs, he rejected alliances with foreign queens, dismissing them as threats wrapped in silken robes. Instead, he turned inward, deeper into the very heart of his dynasty. It began quietly, in chambers hidden from the eyes of courtiers. Priests were summoned, incense was burned, and rituals older than memory were twisted into justifications. What should have been holy union became spectacle, where the line between devotion and desecration dissolved. Before the gods, the pharaoh arranged marriages, not with distant princesses, but with his own daughters. The priests cloaked it as sanctity. They spoke of Horus and Isis, of divine blood looping endlessly upon itself. They wove words like purity, eternity, and sacred duty, until sin itself wore the mask of ritual. Candles flickered against hieroglyphs etched with myths, shadows trembling like silent witnesses as the forbidden was sanctified. You can almost hear the chants rising, can't you? Words that once blessed crops and armies now echoing in service of an act that history itself would whisper about with unease. For the pharaoh, this was no crime, it was destiny fulfilled. To him, it was dynastic duty, a burden he carried not with shame but with grim pride. Each union was a shield against impurity, each daughter reduced in his mind to a vessel carrying sacred lineage forward. He saw himself not as a father transgressing, but as a god preserving the world. But for the daughters, the truth was a prison. Imagine being born in a palace where your first breath marked you not as beloved child, but as instrument of power, where your innocence was not cherished but claimed as currency. They were dressed in gold, their faces painted with kohl, their bodies draped in linens that concealed their terror. And when the doors closed, when the chants filled the air, their childhoods ended. This was not love, this was not choice, it was entrapment, sanctified by men who feared the wrath of their god-king more than they revered the gods themselves. The court knew. Whispers slithered through the corridors, carried by trembling servants and hushed advisors, but fear strangled every voice. Who would dare speak against a ruler proclaimed divine? To question him was to invite death, or worse, eternal damnation in the eyes of those priests who enforced his will. And so the silence held, a silence that protected the throne, but condemned the innocent. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the muffled sobs of daughters who had no words for what was being taken from them, the suffocating weight of rituals turned into cages. Trauma does not need historians to record it, it lingers in the echoes of stone, in the way a palace can feel haunted even centuries later. For the pharaoh, paranoia fed on itself. With each forbidden union, he believed he was securing the throne, weaving a net of heirs immune to betrayal. Yet each step deeper into this territory only made the empire more brittle. What he saw as preservation was, in truth, decay dressed as devotion. And you cannot turn away from this no matter how much you want to, because here lies one of history's darkest truths. When power convinces itself that it acts for destiny, it can sanctify even the unspeakable. The daughters, once princesses of Egypt, were stripped of their identities. No longer symbols of alliance, no longer children free to imagine lives of their own, they became pawns in a game they could never win. Their names may have been etched in temple walls, but their voices were stolen, drowned beneath the chants of priests and the silence of a court too afraid to resist. Psychologically, the fracture was inevitable. For the pharaoh, each act reinforced his god complex, the belief that human morality could not touch him. For his daughters, it carved wounds deeper than any dagger could. Wounds of identity, of autonomy, of spirit. Historians write of dynasties, of battles, of monuments. But what they rarely capture are the invisible scars borne by those trapped in marble cages. And so the first steps into forbidden territory were taken, steps that blurred the boundary between ritual and violation, between devotion and desecration, steps that would set the tone for his reign, leaving a legacy of fear and trauma that would ripple long after the chants fell silent. Even now, centuries later, you can feel the unease in this part of his story. It lingers like smoke from incense that never fully fades. The pharaoh believed he was protecting Egypt, but in truth he was planting seeds of ruin within his own bloodline. And this is where the story darkens further, because if silence held when he bound his daughters to his throne, what silence would follow when his obsession demanded even greater sacrifices? Behind jeweled walls, the royal daughters lived as both queens and captives, mothers of siblings, wives of their father. The palace glistened in sunlight, its walls studded with gems, floors inlaid with polished alabaster, and ceilings painted with constellations meant to mimic eternity. To an outsider, this was paradise. Courtyards filled with perfumed gardens, fountains whispering like silver threads, corridors lined with golden lotus engravings. But beauty can be a mask, and here it concealed a prison. For within this gilded labyrinth, the daughters of the pharaoh were trapped, bound by rituals that crowned them as queens, yet stripped them of every trace of freedom. You must imagine it as they lived it, a golden cage. Every doorway guarded by priests, every corridor patrolled by silence. Their lives were meticulously choreographed, from the meals they ate to the words they spoke. The palace harem was not the place of exotic indulgence often painted in later fantasies. It was a machine, a system designed to control women whose very existence threatened to reveal the empire's darkest secret. On festivals, they were paraded before the people. Draped in jewels, crowned with lotus flowers, they were made to stand beside their father-husband as symbols of divine legitimacy. The crowd, dazzled by gold and ritual, believed they witnessed living goddesses. But beneath the painted smiles, behind the layers of lapis and turquoise, the truth festered. Each procession was a theatre of silence, where trauma was buried under chants of devotion. And when the doors closed, when the echoes of drums faded, the paradox suffocated them. They were queens, yet they were captives. Their names etched in hieroglyphs, their faces carved into temple walls, yet their will erased, their voices stolen. Every title of honor was a chain, every jewel another bar on the cage. Motherhood only deepened the torment. The children they bore were both siblings and offspring, bound by a lineage twisted to serve paranoia. These mothers rocked infants to sleep while drowning in silence, unable to whisper their shame even to each other. Imagine the weight of cradling a child who was proof not of love, but of survival within a system that had erased your choice. Their lullabies were not of freedom, but of resignation. Psychologically, the torment was profound. The daughters were trained to internalize the rituals, to see their suffering not as violation but as duty. The priests reinforced it with relentless precision, cloaking their pain in the language of divinity. You carry the blood of gods, they were told, as if holiness could mask horror. And over time, the silence seeped into them. To speak was death, to resist was annihilation, to endure was the only way forward. And yet, endurance itself became cruelty. The harem system was designed to erase rebellion before it sparked. Servants listened, priests observed, spies lingered in every chamber. A single word of dissent could mean execution, not only for the speaker but for her children, her sisters, her entire bloodline. Survival demanded silence, silence demanded complicity. You can almost feel their hearts beating in unison, can't you? Hearts that longed to scream but instead synchronized to the rhythm of survival. The daughters learned to bury their grief beneath layers of ritual. They painted their eyes in kohl, braided their hair with gold, and smiled in processions that sanctified their captivity. But in the quiet of their chambers, trauma left marks no kohl could conceal. Nights filled with whispers to the gods, prayers not for power or wealth, but for escape from a fate they could never change. And yet the gods remained silent. Or perhaps the priests had silenced them too. The golden cage was not just physical, it was psychological, spiritual. It redefined identity itself. Who were these women? Queens, mothers, goddesses, or prisoners, pawns and victims? Perhaps they were all of these at once, trapped in a paradox so suffocating that even history struggles to name it. The cruelty lay not only in their suffering, but in the fact that their survival depended on their endurance. They learned to embody silence so completely that their trauma became invisible, hidden beneath layers of ritual and procession. They survived, but at a cost so profound it echoed into the very fabric of the dynasty. And you, if you had lived behind those jeweled walls, would you have found the strength to endure? Or would you have chosen rebellion, knowing it would end not just your life, but the lives of every child you bore? That is the cruelty of survival. Endurance becomes both the weapon and the wound. The palace, radiant in the sun, still carries their ghosts. Walk its ruins today and you will feel it. The emptiness between stones, the silence heavier than gold. History records the pharaoh's reign, his monuments, his battles. But the true story lies in the walls that once imprisoned his daughters, in the lives that shimmered like jewels while bleeding in silence. And this silence, this endurance, would come at a price. For what is buried in ritual does not vanish. It festers, it corrodes, it waits. And soon, the empire itself would begin to feel the weight of secrets too heavy to remain hidden. Because when life in the golden cage becomes unbearable, even silence cannot hold forever. The Nile carried whispers, the gods were angry, the people restless, and the palace choked with secrets too heavy to bear. The river, once Egypt's eternal lifeline, now seemed to conspire against its own people. Its floods, unpredictable and cruel, left fields cracked with thirst or drowned in excess. Grain stores emptied faster than they could be replenished, and hunger crept through the villages like a silent invader. To the farmers, to the priests, to the frightened masses watching the stars for omens, there was only one explanation. The gods were displeased. And in Egypt, when the gods turned their faces away, their fury always fell on the shoulders of the pharaoh. You can almost hear those whispers carried in the marketplaces, in the narrow alleys, in the hushed tones of temple courtyards. The unions are cursed, the blood is impure, Egypt is paying the price. Inside the palace, those whispers turned to factions. The generals, hardened men who believed survival depended on conquest and expansion, muttered their discontent. They saw the empire weakening, armies starved of resources, soldiers murmuring of betrayal by the very throne they swore to serve. To them, strength came not from blood purity but from iron and discipline, and so their loyalty wavered, shifting like sand under a restless wind. The priests, on the other hand, doubled down. They defended the pharaoh with ferocity, twisting every famine and plague into further proof of the need for purity. The gods test us, they declared. Only the sacred blood can restore favor. Only obedience can keep Egypt alive. And in their hands, rituals became weapons, tools to silence dissent and fortify the pharaoh's paranoia. The court divided itself into shadows. Advisors whispered behind closed doors, loyalists sharpened their arguments into blades, and rebels began to move like smoke through corridors heavy with incense. Even the marble walls, etched with victories of the past, seemed to shiver beneath the weight of secrets. And then there were the daughters, caught in the middle of a storm they never asked for. For them, loyalty was not a choice but a torment. Each day they wore the crowns placed upon their heads, each day they walked in golden processions, and yet inside, desperation clawed at them. Some surrendered to silence, telling themselves their endurance was survival, convincing themselves that obedience was the only shield left. They painted their faces, they smiled for the crowds, and they swallowed their grief like bitter wine. But not all could. Some resisted quietly, in ways so small they barely seemed like rebellion. A glance exchanged in secret, a prayer whispered not to the gods of the temples, but to forgotten household spirits, an attempt to comfort a sister when the guards turned their backs. These fragments of resistance were fragile, but they mattered, because even in the golden cage, the human spirit searches for cracks in the walls. The pharaoh, however, saw resistance everywhere. His paranoia, once a flicker, now blazed like fire. He believed the gods spoke through every omen, through every withered stalk of grain, through every restless whisper of the people. And what the gods told him, he was certain was clear. Egypt was surrounded by enemies, and even within the palace, betrayal lurked. So he tightened his grip. Guards doubled their watches, daughters were confined more strictly, rituals multiplied until they consumed every waking hour. What might have once been holy became suffocating, endless ceremonies meant to keep both the gods and his household under code and troll. The incense grew thicker, the prayers louder, the punishments harsher. Imagine the palace in those days, candles burning late into the night, corridors echoing not with laughter but with footsteps of soldiers, the daughters moving like shadows, their faces serene in public but carved with dread in private. priests chanting over altars where offerings piled high while outside the people starved. A world of contradictions. Abundance and famine, loyalty and betrayal, silence and rebellion. And you can feel the tension mounting, can't you? Every whisper outside becomes a storm inside. Every conflict in the court fuels the fire of the Pharaoh's mind. Every choice he makes becomes more desperate, more cruel. It is in moments like these that dynasties fracture. Not in great battles, not in sudden collapse, but in whispers, in secrets, in the small betrayals that grow into storms. Egypt was beginning to fracture, and though the statues of gods still stood tall, their silence became unbearable. The daughters bore the heaviest burden. For them, each day was a war between loyalty and self-preservation. Some clung to faith, telling themselves that endurance was duty. Others dreamed of escape, though they knew escape was impossible. And in the eyes of the Pharaoh, both obedience and resistance looked the same. Threats to be controlled, threats to be punished. So the cruelty deepened. His paranoia demanded proof of loyalty, demanded submission in every glance, every gesture. And when that proof faltered, even slightly, punishment followed. Fear became the air they breathed, and silence the only language left. But paranoia cannot sustain an empire, it can only consume it. And though the Pharaoh believed his grip was iron, though he convinced himself that only his blood could save Egypt, the cracks in the palace were widening. The Nile carried whispers, the gods remained silent, and the people, restless and hungry, began to look not to their ruler, but to the shadows. The question now was no longer whether Egypt could endure, but how much cruelty it would endure before the silence broke. In hidden corridors and midnight whispers, the silenced began to plot, against a man both their father and their ruler. The palace, once a gilded cage, became a labyrinth of secrets. Hallways that smelled of incense and polished stone now carried the weight of hushed voices and fleeting glances. The air thickened not just with ritual smoke, but with the quiet rebellion of those who had suffered too long in silence. You can almost feel it, like sparks waiting for dry kindling, a restless energy pulsing behind walls adorned with gold. It began, as most rebellions do, not with grand gestures, but with the smallest defiance. A daughter refusing to recite a prayer meant to sanctify her role. A palace servant passing along a rumor to a sympathetic priest. A piece of forbidden information finding its way to foreign ears. These were not swords raised in battle, they were whispers sharpened into blades, delicate but deadly. For the daughters, resistance often meant clinging to their identity. Imagine being forced into roles that erased you, not as child, not as woman, but as vessel, as pawn, as ornament of your father's obsession. To resist, they tried to remember who they had once been. Some kept hidden tokens, a childhood bracelet, a piece of cloth embroidered with a mother's hand, a small amulet from a forgotten god, tiny fragments of self smuggled into the heart of their captivity. And yet, rebellion was dangerous. The Pharaoh's paranoia had grown into cruelty, and cruelty into ritualized vengeance. Banishments came first. Those suspected of disloyalty were sent away, stripped of titles, their names erased from records. To an Egyptian, erasure was worse than death. To be forgotten was to vanish from eternity. Others met harsher ends, executions staged under the guise of sacred curses, punishments declared as divine justice rather than human wrath. But every act of violence only fed the fire. For when you watch a sister exiled, when you see a friend executed under the cold gaze of priests, your silence becomes harder to swallow. You begin to realize that obedience guarantees nothing but survival in chains, while defiance, though dangerous, offers the faintest chance of reclaiming yourself. Some women reached out beyond the palace walls. Whispers traveled to priests who, though outwardly loyal, doubted the righteousness of Pharaoh's unions. A few of these priests, perhaps seeking their own power, perhaps truly disturbed by the corruption of sacred law, carried these whispers into temples, into villages, into the ears of foreigners who watched Egypt with hungry eyes. You see, Egypt was never isolated. Neighboring kingdoms, Hittites, Nubians, Assyrians, kept spies as close as shadows, waiting for the cracks in the great empire to widen. And now the palace itself was feeding them. Can you picture it? A foreign envoy, seated politely at a banquet, accepting gifts with smiles, while a palace woman leans close, her words masked as flattery, but her eyes pleading as she slips secrets across the table. Small details, troop movements, food shortages, tensions in the court. To the envoy, valuable intelligence. To the woman, a gamble that perhaps exposing her father might someday free her children. Psychological rebellion was even more dangerous because it could not be chained. Even when their bodies were controlled, their minds sought freedom. A daughter might submit outwardly to rituals but whisper forbidden prayers to herself in the dark. Another might hold conversations in her imagination with the mother who had been silenced, drawing strength from an inner dialogue Pharaoh could never touch. This defiance was invisible, but it was real. It kept them human in a world trying to strip them of humanity. Yet Pharaoh saw shadows everywhere, his paranoia sharpened into obsession. He believed curses were necessary, that executions were not punishments but sacred offerings demanded by the gods. Each time a daughter was silenced, each time a servant vanished, he convinced himself he was purifying Egypt. But in truth he was purging trust, draining loyalty, and fueling the very resistance he feared. The palace walls, once meant to protect him, now became a fortress of suspicion. No one dared speak freely. Smiles grew brittle, laughter vanished, even footsteps seemed cautious, as though the marble itself were listening. You can almost imagine walking those corridors, hearing the echo of your own steps, afraid that even the sound of your breath might betray you. And yet, resistance persisted, because oppression breeds rebellion as surely as famine breeds hunger. The cracks widened. What began as midnight whispers grew into currents strong enough to shift the palace itself. Some women still obeyed, clinging to survival. Others risked everything, even knowing the price. Together they carried the unbearable weight of a forbidden system, and the weight was beginning to fracture the throne. For you, watching this unfold centuries later, the tragedy is clear. You know how dangerous secrets can be, how paranoia can corrode power from the inside out. But for them, those daughters, and those women trapped in golden walls, the future was not a lesson, it was a gamble. Every whispered word, every hidden token, every stolen prayer might be the spark that either freed them or destroyed them. The seeds had been planted. The soil was watered with fear, with shame, with blood. And though Pharaoh still believed his control unshakable, the roots of rebellion were already growing beneath his feet. The only question left, when would those seeds bloom into fire? When gods are mocked, their revenge comes swift. His final years crumbled in blood, betrayal, and a dynasty shattered. The twilight of Pharaoh's reign did not arrive with the dignity of fading sunlight. It came like a storm tearing through a fragile vessel. Egypt, once the center of unshakable grandeur, began to tremble under the weight of curses it could no longer deny. The Nile, lifeblood of the kingdom, flooded at the wrong times, leaving fields drowned one season and parched the next. Harvests failed, plagues struck livestock, and whispers filled the villages. The gods have turned their backs on Egypt. And who did they blame? Not distant enemies, not unseen demons. No, the people pointed their trembling fingers toward the palace itself, toward the man who called himself divine, toward the father king who had defiled the very blood he claimed sacred. You can almost hear those whispers swelling like a tide. He is no god, he is a curse. Rebellion rose not as a single spark, but as countless small fires. Priests who once anointed him with oils now stood in temples denouncing him. Their voices, heavy with divine authority, spread like contagion. The Pharaoh has broken Ma'at, the balance of the world. Soldiers, once loyal, began to question their oaths when their families starved and their pay dwindled. Commoners refused to bow in the markets. Even the walls of the palace seemed to lean closer, heavy with secrets too poisonous to hold. But perhaps the greatest curse was carried not by enemies but by his own children. The offspring born of unions meant to preserve purity came frail, sickly or deformed. Some could not survive infancy. Others, though they lived, bore the marks of weakness that the people could not ignore. In a world where the king's body symbolized the body of the land, these children became living omens. Each cough, each twisted limb, each early grave whispered that the dynasty itself was rotting from the inside. Imagine the psychological torment for the daughters. They bore children who should have been princes and princesses of destiny, but instead became symbols of shame. These mothers loved their children, yet each love was pierced with guilt and fear. To cradle a child marked by sickness was to cradle the evidence of their father's sins. They were trapped in an endless paradox. Loyalty demanded silence, but silence fed decay. Pharaoh, meanwhile, tightened his grip with desperation. Paranoia no longer whispered, it screamed. He saw plots in every shadow, betrayal in every smile. Advisors were dismissed, generals executed, priests silenced. The palace became a place of blood offerings rather than sacred wisdom. You can imagine walking through its courtyards then, the red of sunset mixing with the darker stains left on the stone. Fear replaced reverence, and obedience became fragile, cracking under its own weight. Plots did not come only from his enemies, they came from within his own family. Sons and daughters who once obeyed began to dream of freedom, even if that freedom meant their father's end. Servants, loyal for generations, began to choose survival over tradition. Foreign powers, always waiting at Egypt's borders, heard of unrest and sharpened their daggers. The throne was no longer a seat of stability, it was a chair balanced over fire. And then came the end. Accounts differ. Here for history bends beneath the weight of fear and shame. Some say his death was natural, his body finally succumbing to years of stress, sickness, and divine punishment. Others claim it was violent, that poison touched his lips or a dagger found his heart, guided by the hands of those closest to him. What is certain is this: his death was not celebrated as the passing of a god, but as the closing of a wound. Funerary rites, once lavish displays of eternal glory, were muted. His name, which should have been carved in triumph, was instead whispered with unease. Priests performed the rituals, but their chants lacked conviction. The people did not mourn, they exhaled. His daughters wept, yes, but their tears carried as much relief as grief. The dynasty he sought to protect had been hollowed out, its foundations eaten by the very practices he believed would preserve it. This was no golden burial of a god-king, this was the burial of shame. His memory became a warning, not a legacy. The dynasty crumbled, its heirs too weak, too tainted, too divided to hold the weight of empire. Egypt would continue, yes, but never the same. The cracks in the throne had become an open wound, one that enemies would soon exploit. And you, sitting centuries away, can feel the irony with piercing clarity. A man who tried to become eternal by bending bloodlines, by mocking the gods, instead ensured his name would be remembered for ruin. He wanted immortality. What he achieved was infamy. But let me ask you this. If power can corrupt so deeply, if love can be twisted into chains, what then becomes of the world left behind? What happens when the children of sin are forced to live with the sins of their fathers? The story does not end with his death. No, what came after was perhaps even darker. What survives longer than pyramids is memory, and his legacy was carved not in stone but in whispered shame. And hidden trauma. Death for most pharaohs was the beginning of eternity. Tombs glistened with treasure, temples echoed with hymns, names carved deep into limestone so that they might be spoken for millennia. But for this pharaoh, the god-king who sought to preserve his power by binding blood to blood, death was not eternity, it was erasure. His successors, ashamed and fearful, ordered that his name be scratched out from temple walls, chiseled away from monuments, removed from sacred lists. To the Egyptians, to be forgotten was the ultimate curse, and so they condemned him to what they called the second death, the death of memory. You can almost picture it, workers with chisels under torchlight hammering away at hieroglyphs that once proclaimed divinity, dust falling like ash as the symbols of eternity disappeared into silence. Priests turned their faces, as though even looking upon his name might summon curses. To erase him was to cleanse Egypt, but memory is stubborn. You cannot kill whispers with chisels. In marketplaces, in the corners of temples, in the homes of nobles and servants alike, the story remained. Mothers warned their daughters with half-remembered tales. Do not trust the palace, for even gods can corrupt their children. Priests whispered warnings into their pupils' ears. When blood is defiled, kingdoms crumble. Foreign visitors carried the scandal beyond Egypt's borders, weaving his sins into tales of caution that travelled down trade routes like shadows attached to silk and gold. And then there were the daughters. Their names, once inscribed in glory, began to vanish from record. Some were reduced to fragments, a title half preserved, a tomb never finished, a mention in a decree with the name hastily scratched away. Others disappeared entirely as though they had never lived, yet you know they lived. You can feel them in the silences of history, the women who endure. Jeweled captivity, who bore children caught between shame and survival. They became ghosts, not because they lacked life, but because history refused to remember their pain. The trauma did not end with them. The children born of those forbidden unions carried the weight forward. Imagine growing up as a prince or princess, yet whispered about as cursed, as frail, as the living proof of corruption. Some did not survive to adulthood, others became pawns, quietly moved aside to protect what was left of the dynasty. Their very existence was a paradox. They were both heirs and shame, both the future and the reminder of a terrible past. Psychologically, the toll was immeasurable. You can sense it in the fragments of art and ritual from that era, stiffened figures, forced symbolism of purity, frantic prayers to gods who seemed deaf. Egypt's rulers clung tighter to rituals of blood purity, as though doubling down might erase the curse. But doubling down only weakened them further. Each marriage between close kin narrowed the bloodline. Each denial of foreign alliances isolated Egypt from the wider world. What began as one pharaoh's obsession grew into a dynasty's downfall. For the common people, the memory lingered differently. They saw the failings of their rulers mirrored in the failings of the land. Crops that failed, children who died young, temples that fell into disrepair, all were woven into the legend of a god-king who mocked the gods and was punished. Stories passed like warnings. Balance must never be broken, or the Nile itself will rise against you. For you, centuries later, the irony is heavy. This pharaoh believed he was securing eternity through purity, through rituals, through absolute control. Yet his eternity became precisely the opposite. Not golden tombs or eternal hymns, but silence, shame, and trauma woven into memory. What outlived him was not his monument, but the psychological scars carried by his daughters, his children, his people. The pyramids stood untouched, but his legacy became a caution etched into whispers rather than stone. And here is where you, as the listener, must pause, because this story is not just ancient history, it is human history. Again and again, across time, rulers have tried to manipulate blood, purity, and power. Again and again, the cost has been borne not by the rulers themselves, but by their children, their families, their people. Trauma does not vanish when records are erased. It buries itself in silence, waiting for someone, centuries later, to notice the missing names. Think about that. Names scratched away from walls, but the pain still echoing in every gap. Isn't that the most haunting immortality of all? Not glory, not reverence, but the inability to forget what others tried so desperately to hide. And as successors tried to steady Egypt, the cracks widened. The dynasty, weakened by its obsession with blood purity, grew vulnerable. Foreign powers pressed closer. Internal strife festered. The once mighty empire that had outlasted countless generations now found itself stumbling, its heart hollowed by the sins of one man. So what truly survives? Is it the monuments, the rituals, or is it the trauma that seeps into the marrow of memory, resurfacing whenever power is abused, whenever innocence is sacrificed at the altar of control? The pharaoh's name may have been erased, but his story lingers as a shadow that even stone cannot bury. And as Egypt entered its next chapter, the question became clear. Could a civilization survive when its foundations were built not on glory, but on silence? The golden mask of kingship cracked, revealing a truth as old as time. Power built on cruelty devours itself in silence. And here, at the end of this journey, you must pause. You have walked through gilded halls that hid horrors, through rituals cloaked in incense but dripping with blood, through whispers that turned into rebellion, and through the silence of erased names. What remains now is not spectacle, not grandeur, but reflection. Reflection on the cost of power, what it takes when it feeds not on wisdom or justice, but on family, humanity, and innocence. Egypt is remembered by most for its pyramids, for its colossal statues, for the eternal gaze of the Sphinx. We marvel at its achievements, the geometry of stone, the poetry of hieroglyphs, the grandeur of kings who called themselves gods. But in the shadows of those monuments lie truths too dark to carve in stone. You see, history does not just build monuments, it buries sins. And the scandal of this Pharaoh, the god-king who turned his daughters into pawns, his children into curses, and his dynasty into ash, is one of those sins. What makes his story so haunting is not only what he did, but why he did it. He believed himself divine, beyond ordinary morality. He believed purity would preserve power, that ritual would sanctify cruelty, that silence would erase shame. In doing so, he confused survival with purity, and purity with cruelty. It is a cycle older than Egypt and one that echoes across every age. How many rulers, how many fathers, how many leaders have hidden their sins behind the mask of duty? How many times has cruelty been justified in the name of protection? And here, you must turn inward. Because this story is not only about a pharaoh lost to time, it is about us. About the way humanity remembers glory but silences trauma, praises monuments but forgets the broken lives behind them. His dynasty may be gone, but his story lingers as a warning carved not in stone but in silence, in whispers, in the cracks of history where truth refuses to die. Think of his daughters, the queens who were also captives, adorned in gold, yet stripped of freedom. Think of the children who were born to bear crowns but carried sickness instead, who lived as symbols of shame rather than heirs of glory. Their names are missing, but their pain remains. Their silence is louder than monuments, and you, listening now, are one of the few who can still hear it. Isn't that the true legacy of power unchecked? Not the palaces or the pyramids, but the lives it devoured and the trauma it buried. Power does not only build, it consumes. And when it consumes family, when it devours innocence, when it chains love and calls it duty, it ensures its own destruction. That is why his story ends not in triumph, but in ruin. The gods he mocked needed no thunderbolts. His cruelty was his curse. Even now, his shadow lingers. You can see it in every tale where rulers cling to purity at the cost of humanity. You can feel it in every system that values silence over truth. You can recognize it in the cycles of history, where power repeats its mistakes because memory prefers monuments to pain. That is why this story matters, because it warns us not of what was, but of what always can be. And so, as you leave this tale behind, carry its weight with you. Let it haunt you the way silence haunted his daughters. Let it remind you that unchecked power always hungers, that cruelty dressed as duty always destroys, and that the cost of forgetting is always higher than the cost of remembering. Egypt, the empire of stone, the land of gods and kings, shines still in memory, but alongside its glory lies its darkness. The pharaoh's mask may be gone, his name erased, but his truth endures. When power confuses purity with cruelty, when survival is purchased with silence, it does not preserve, it devours. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. So I ask you, what stories will we choose to remember, and what silences will we allow to bury the truth?